Alright, what's going on YouTube? Brutal Death by here once again. How are you guys doing? I just wanted to share my thoughts on something that's been on my mind the past couple of weeks, so I hope you don't mind a bit of a different video today as I lay out some of those thoughts. This video won't be featuring any gameplay tips or guides, so if you've come to my channel looking for that, I'll have more of that content coming up soon. This video is more of a small gameplay update with some social commentary, so if that's not your thing and you click off, I totally understand. The gameplay here is mainly footage of me grinding bolt actions to level up my scout class for my scout class guide. I still have a ways to go before I unlock the Martini Henry, so I might do a couple of live gameplay videos on the channel here just with me playing with the bolt actions if you guys want. Let me know if that's something that you are interested in. So I just wanted to give my viewers a heads up on some updates for Battlefield 1. DICE is working on their first patch to clean up the game. Of particular note, it looks like DICE will be looking at rebalancing the map Suez by adding more conquest flags on the map. I always was a little surprised that a map of that relative size with so many sprawling corridors and engagement directions was only given 3 linear flags. This really stripped a fair bit of strategy and depth out of the map since, the only direction to go was forward or backwards. The B flag location was a particular nightmare to capture, especially if you were British, as the majority of the B capture zone was wide out in the open with almost no cover to hide behind, leaving you exposed to sniper fire out in the distant sand dunes and an easy target for mortar spam. The Ottomans had a massive dune leading up to the capture point that they could crop their heads over, and from what I found, the place is almost constantly being bombarded with gas, which makes tactical sense, but doesn't make capturing very fun as your range is handicapped with that gas mask on, trying to hide from long-range rifle fire, and praying that a tank doesn't flush you out or mortar doesn't kill you. The Ottomans also have easier access to a building just north of the capture point, which is still in the B capture zone as well, so they can capture from cover quite easily. Overall, I just don't think it's the best placement. I understand that a lot of players, they like that simple flag layout that they don't really have to think too much about, but I myself, with my play style in mind, do agree that DICE could make the map way more enjoyable to play on with more flags, better placement, and more strategic depth. I actually really do like the map Suez, so hopefully this will improve it even further. And DICE is also looking to squash some bugs with this patch. Now, the release of Battlefield 1 has been stable both client-side and server-side, and thank the pagan gods of Adad and Vishnu with the blood of 1,000 infants that the hit registration is actually very solid, but there's still a ton of annoying bugs that need to be squashed. Things like not being able to fire your gun after being revived, or not being able to ADS, or spawning in on a tank, horse, or plane, and just spawning in as that class's infantry stranded on the ground without your vehicle or horse, or you mount an anti-tank rifle on a ledge and it won't fire, or trying to mount or vault over a ledge and your character just keeps getting pulled back to the ground, and I'm trying to get behind cover or move my soldier, and of course you get stuck on a small pebble or rock and just can't move. You have piss poor spawns and a myriad of just other little bugs and glitches, and some of these are legacy bugs that are just rearing their ugly heads more than once in the Frostbite engine. I don't know what it is about Frostbite games, but they can be clunky at times. I personally have been killed or at least impeded by these bugs, and I've always been a huge believer in Battlefield that split-second hesitations and delays like this often does get you killed, and it's pretty lame and detracts from the polish of the overall experience. I can certainly give the game some benefit of the doubt since it's only been out a few weeks, and like I said earlier, it's pretty stable, and there could be far worse problems out there for this game. And on the whole, Battlefield 1 is a far more complex shooter than most games out there, and thankfully DICE have proven themselves great game developers that listen to feedback and engage with the community and improve their games over time, so here's hoping. And in addition to these fixes in December, we'll be seeing a free DLC map, Giant Shadow, as well as the return of hardcore mode and a new mode called Fog of War. So, new game modes are always peachy. And, this is where a lot of YouTubers might perhaps end their video, but I still actually wanted to talk a bit about the history behind Battlefield 1 and the current cultural and political climate that games are being made in today, and how concepts like inclusive diversity, social justice, identity politics, and political correctness have affected AAA games such as Battlefield 1, and the game design decisions that are being made by publishers and game developers alike, and indeed how that is impacting the gaming industry itself. It used to be that in the 90s, I think it's fair to say that video games were viewed by the mainstream as juvenile distractions only enjoyed by children, and that was largely true at the time. Us gamers were a relatively young generation back then. Many of us were not even born yet. When I was 5 or 6 years old, the first video game I ever played was Super Mario Bros. For the Nintendo Entertainment System. I remember I had a buddy down the street who I actually wasn't that interested in being a real friend to, and I would only go over to his house so I could play his Super Mario Bros. On his NES. I was really only using him so I could play that game, which I'm aware there actually makes me a horrible human being. And, gamers like us, we started growing up and continuing to game and witness gaming technology and hardware evolve. In the early 2000s, we had a lot more controversy from politicians and the religious right wing to ban evil, violent video games around the base implication that violent video games directly correlated with an increase in real-world violence and acting out, which has actually been discredited by several studies that found that narrative to be demonstrably false and an irrelevant factor in determining real-world violence. Turns out rational, sane people are able to separate their identities from the identities and the worlds of the characters that they see on screen. Rational and ethical people are able to readily discern that the rules and consequences in a video game are vastly different from that of the rules and consequences of real life. The same reasons one doesn't go and rob a bank or casino after watching Ocean's 11 are the same reasons that after playing GTA 5, I don't go around thinking it's okay to stuff a hooker in a crawl space. Or after listening to some Viking death metal like Amon Amarth, do I then brandish a battle axe and go on a pillaging, rampaging spree and capture women to take home to enslave as my brood sows? We understand these are mediums meant to depict art and entertainment, and video games are becoming a larger part of it, with violent video games getting mature and adult ratings similar to movies to ensure the end user had emotional, maturity to the point that they've developed enough to handle graphic and mature content. Ultimately, video games are about escapism and fantasy and having fun while foregoing the stresses and hardships of everyday mundane life, giving people an outlet to vent and focus their frustration and angst. In fact, played in moderation, video games can have a net positive effect on the mental health of the individual, improving cognitive functions such as rapid decision-making, quicker reflexes, and sharper perception, which makes sense given that, those are some of the skills needed to excel in a first-person shooter. Video games have even shown to help alleviate those suffering from mental illness in cases such as depression. So it's a little wonder why video games have evolved from, its semi-juvenile 4-bit and 8-bit origins, to become a multi-billion-dollar industry and a cutting-edge form of interactive entertainment, a creative art form, and even social interaction platform for the upcoming social media generation. It's a little surprise to me that the average gamer is now in their 20s or 30s, and the medium has evolved with the times to stay relevant. Now just so you know, I was born in the late 80s, which makes me a millennial, and it's no secret that we've seen some interesting political resurgences and seen a very vocal minority in my generation inculcated with aggressive pushes in social justice, privilege theory with progressive, equality of outcome-based thinking, identity and class politics with oppression-based intersectionality values attached to them, inclusive diversity and authoritarian language policing, and soul-crushing political correctness in both our culture and our political climate from my generation. Many of which these Marxist ideologies were passed on down from the baby boomers and disseminated into our colleges and institutions of education, and that's really made its way at a pervasive level into our pop culture and the content we consume. And because of that, even video games and video game culture started getting policed through this lens of draconian political dogma. Now, in case you had no idea what the hell I just said, don't worry about it too much. It's essentially a form of Orwellian newspeak that employs an indoctrination thought reform technique called loading the language, where they change and stretch the definition of words and semantics and add new words to their vocabulary of approved speech. This is meant to curtail undesirable thinking patterns, aka wrongthink, and also lead you down intended thought curves. For instance, changing the definition of hate speech from speech that evokes discrimination-based hatred and bigotry and a call to violence to simply having a dissenting worldview or different political opinion from the established doctrine or political dogma.
Everything is sexist, everything is racist, everything is homophobic.
I'll post the BITE model for free thinking and how to combat indoctrination and what's called undue influence here in the description if you're interested about learning about that and not being tricked into being brainwashed into an ideology. But I am digressing. 2014 saw the Gamergate controversy, which I won't waste my breath on here since there's about 1 million videos explaining the specifics, and I'm already 2 years late to the discussion. But it involves Zoe Quinn and third-wave feminist gaming culture critic Anita Sarkeesian. And in that same year, Ubisoft made the grave mistake of not including female playable characters in its cast of Assassin's Creed Unity. When questioned as to why they had committed this egregious error of blatant white supremacist heteronormative patriarchy, it was fairly clear the development team was caught off guard that this was even an issue. And instead of answering what I believe was most likely the most truthful response, that, they never intended to make female characters and they had full creative license of their story and cast that didn't need to placate or be accountable to the arbitrary moral authority of diversity quotas and political correctness, the developers ended up caving to the pressure and instead gave the bullshit excuse that, the female characters were too difficult to program and animate as a smokescreen and attempt to save face. And that excuse was easily picked apart and used as ammo to further the narrative that women were being excluded from video games. Around this time, we saw the creation of Anita Sarkeesian's somewhat infamous crowdfunded project, Tropes vs. Women in Video Games. No longer were females in video games allowed to be portrayed as damsels in distress, or having clothing that was too revealing, or be too emotional, or be shown in any position of weakness or vulnerability whatsoever, or have any hip-to-waist ratio or any breast larger than the C cup. That was a big no-no. Only badass, male-spurning, independent, capital F female characters were acceptable, who could hang with the baddest of dudes and kick ass and take names. And even if developers went to the concerted lengths to have these kinds of characters in their games, there was always something else that was nitpicked or, viewed as problematic. You jump through 10 hoops for these people, only to find that there are another 10 hoops for you to jump through after that.
Everything is sexist. Everything is racist. Everything is homophobic.
Everything is sexist. Everything's offensive to people like me.
The idea of these videos was that these game developers were part of a social construct hierarchical power structure that disseminated toxic attitudes towards women down to young boys subliminally through these video games. The boy sees the girl in the game and then treats the girls he sees in real life the same way. It's the same line of thinking as before with the violence. The boy sees the violence in the game and then goes and does the violence in real life. No longer could AAA game developers and game publishers focus on their target demographics and customer base to make sales, which was comprised of mainly males. I know there are hardcore female gamers out there too, but the data suggests that the majority of female gamers still gravitate towards the more casual mobile and freemium games market. So no longer could they focus on their mainly male demographic and tailor their product to their customers' tastes and let the culture of gaming evolve organically from the ground up, as has pretty much been the main sociological engine of our species in everything we do up until this point. But now instead they have to watch out for social justice hawks like Anita Sarkeesian that can swoop in and criticize their games if they are not meeting the PC agenda standards and cause bad publicity for their games and harm their brand as not being inclusive enough or, misogynistic to women or whatever else slander that they have for you. And personally, I think it's a very smart move for these publishers and developers to make their games as palatable and politically safe as possible. After all, AAA games are extremely expensive to produce and they carry huge investment risks, and costs are only going to rise as hardware and gaming demands become more complex and sophisticated. Now we're already seeing mid-generation console upgrades. The headaches never end for these poor overworked developers and programmers. In 2016, a AAA title pretty much needs to sell well on a global scale in order to turn a profit or make any money whatsoever. So in the current year, it's no surprise to me that Battlefield 1 has a fairly diverse array of ethnicities in its soldiers, more so than what would actually be proportionally accurate in the World War I era. If you wanted to be more historically accurate, then the majority of these characters would be white Europeans. But I understand having, the East Indian and black demographics in there as well. What was surprising to me though was the backlash from media outlets about it portraying actual world history in a gruesome manner. We haven't really had a AAA historical World War shooter since 2008's Call of Duty, and things were relatively tame and benign back then. But with the current year, with its boost in realistic graphics and visual fidelity, I can understand the raw grit and hard-hitting impact of Battlefield 1's historical setting, easily upsetting the delicate sensibilities of PC culture and them wanting to discourage players from partaking in the game and shielding it from the realities of history, that it was really trying to portray. And if you think about it, they have a point. Could you imagine being in the front lines when the whistle blows and you have to go over the top and charge through no man's land? Or, you're running and you're struck in the chest with hot lead and you have no body armor on? Or you have to piss into a napkin and hold it to your mouth because this is the first time you or your countrymen have encountered chlorine gas and you don't have a gas mask? Or the enemy is trying to break through your line of defense, and as you line up your target, you pull the trigger and your rifle jams because it's caked full of mud and sand. Believe it or not, a lot of guns actually did jam in World War I. It's not like Battlefield 1 where they always work, and all you've got is your pistol and your shovel to defend yourself with at that point, so you might be SOL. or you might have to, treat the boils and the pustules on your body because it was exposed to mustard gas, or you have to amputate your own trench foot. Like, the list of horrors goes on is pretty much what I'm saying, and I'm personally indebted in gratitude that I will not have to face, the shock and horror that these men went through, and, even paid with their lives. But unlike the social justice ideologues on the left, I do not wish to censor and hide away from it, but rather acknowledge the fascinating history and deep sacrifices of these servicemen. And what better way to learn about its history and arouse, our intellectual faculties than through a medium of entertainment that we frequently engaged with. This whole idea that if something like a violent war is being depicted, even if it's just a simple matter of historical fact, that makes it somehow an implicit endorsement of that violence, it's a conflation that I just don't get. Like I said, sane, rational people can separate themselves and their reality from what is being shown on a screen. A similar conflation of depiction versus endorsement happened when Apple banned Civil War games from its App Store because those games were showing images of the Confederate flag, even though the Confederate flag was historical to the American Civil War. But, it was considered a symbol of hate. So somehow they think that, if it's showing that you're somehow endorsing it, even if it's a part of history. I just don't get it. And, funny enough, even with all of this diversity in Battlefield 1, it still wasn't enough for, a select few social justice feminists who were upset that women weren't being represented as soldiers in the game. Like, sorry ladies, I'm afraid that's a simple matter of history rather than social justice. DICE clearly wasn't going to rewrite history for the sake of your narrative. Women weren't in the war, and racism was alive and well, and there's still plenty of progress to be made during that time. But, what are my thoughts on all of this diverse political correctness in video games? Does it bother me? Not terribly. At times it can be obnoxious, but it really depends on how it's handled. I think SJWs put way too much stock into the identities of their game characters rather than the actual characters themselves. It's like if you have a token minority oppressed LGBT character in a game whose only purpose is to be LGBT and announce to the world, I just find it's a big, vapid virtue signal just ramming the PC agenda down our throats. Like, it's not anything special. It's like, okay, so you're this LGBTQAI LMNOP+ otherkin with custom bling pronouns. What does that have to do with the story? Or how's that relevant whatsoever? I really could care less about the sex, the race, the gender, the class, the religion, or whatever other label you want to throw on the character, as long as they're just that, a good character who is well written. I really couldn't care less otherwise. I think, IPs like The Last of Us have really likable, relatable female characters in them. And I also like Rey from Star Wars The Force Awakens. Even though some people complain that she was a Mary Sue character, I still found her likable and spunky. Whereas, you have some other failed attempts at a politically correct effort, such as the new Ghostbusters. And, it sucks because I like, quite a few of the actresses in that movie, like Melissa McCarthy. And I could have been down for some female Ghostbusters, but the writing was just so bad and unfunny, and the PC agenda was so heavy-handed and blatant in that movie, I just couldn't get into it whatsoever. So at this point, I think I'm going to wrap it up. I think I've talked enough about social justice and, just examples of it in our everyday lives, in pop culture, in gaming. But I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on the issue. What is your take on political correctness in the gaming industry or society at large? Do you agree or disagree with what's been said today? Are there any thoughts you'd like to add? Are you a shit-posting, alt-right, Pepe-meming, God Emperor, Trump-worshipping, Betacuck blaster? Or are you a postmodernist, Marxist, anti-capitalist, social justice, third-wave feminists? If you guys want to leave a comment, you know what to do. But that's what it's really going to be today, guys. I won't take up any more of your time, but I do hope that you have enjoyed this or found this at least somewhat interesting. This has been Brutal Death Pie, and I'll speak with you guys again soon. Have a good one. I'm out.